Ellis, Routh and Liza Hallen were once just names buried in forgotten film credits. He, a reclusive special effects artist, she, a fading horror actress. But when a demolition crew uncovered a hidden basement filled with disturbing VHS tapes and evidence of a long-missing child, their names resurfaced in a nightmare that blurred the line between performance and real-life terror. In the quiet New England town of Crestwick, the house at 47 Hollister Lane had long been the subject of uneasy whispers and neighborhood rumors. Sitting at the end of a dead-end road, the decaying two-story home looked more like a set piece from an old horror film than a real residence. Its windows were covered in thick grime. The front porch sagged under years of neglect, and ivy crept up its walls like green veins wrapping a corpse. For nearly 2 decades, it had remained untouched, left to rot in silence, while life went on around it. Children crossed the street rather than walk past it. Teenagers dared one another to knock on the front door at night, but no one ever stayed long. People said they heard sounds, low groans, scratching, the shuffle of footsteps, though no one had lived there since 2004. What made the house more than just a local curiosity was its strange history. The last recorded resident was a man named Ellis Routh, a reclusive special effects artist who had retired abruptly from the horror film industry. He was never seen again after a night in late October, just days before Halloween. Neighbors reported strange activity that week, late-night deliveries, large black trash bags being loaded into the house, and a constant flickering glow in the windows, as though someone was running an old film projector inside. Then, silence. Ellis vanished without a trace. His car was later found burned in the woods nearly 50 miles away. Police found no body, no sign of foul play, and eventually ruled it as an unsolved missing person case. The property fell into legal limbo and was forgotten. That was until September 2022, when a development company bought the land for a future apartment complex. Demolition crews were sent in to clear the house, which they assumed would be an easy teardown. But on the second day of work, a member of the crew accidentally struck a hollow-sounding section of the basement wall. Curious, he pried it open and discovered a sealed room. Unlike the rest of the house, this hidden space was clean, preserved, and insulated. The walls were lined with soundproof foam. In the center of the room was a table stacked with VHS tapes, an old television, and several notebooks. Animal bones, bleached white, were carefully arranged in circular patterns on the floor. A single chair faced the wall, where a white sheet had been stapled up like a makeshift projection screen. The discovery halted the demolition immediately. Authorities were called, and the room was sealed off for investigation. It didn't take long for the contents of the tapes to raise alarm. Each cassette was labeled in a careful hand, numbered sequentially with titles like Rehearsal 1, Rehearsal 2, and so on. One tape was simply marked Final Take. No one yet knew what the tapes contained, but the eerie setup and the meticulous attention to detail suggested something far more disturbing than forgotten home videos. The house on Hollister Lane had kept its secrets buried for years, but now its story was finally beginning to surface. The tapes recovered from the hidden basement quickly became the centerpiece of the investigation. Each one was carefully labeled in neat handwriting, with titles like Rehearsal 1, Rehearsal 2, all the way through Rehearsal 11. The final tape stood out immediately. It was marked with a different pen, darker and more jagged, and simply read, Final Take. Investigators began by watching the first tape, hoping to understand the nature of what they had discovered. What played out on the screen was unsettling, not because of violence or gore, but because of its disturbing sense of purpose. It appeared to be a mock scene, a carefully staged kidnapping carried out by 2 individuals wearing masks. The location was clearly the same house on Hollister Lane, down to the wallpaper and furniture. But instead of a real child or victim, there was a mannequin dressed in pajamas tied to a chair. Each subsequent tape followed a similar pattern. There was no sound, no dialogue, only the quiet whir of the camera and the creaking of footsteps on wooden floors. In Rehearsal 3, a porcelain-masked figure directed others like a film crew, using hand gestures and cue cards to guide their movements. One person adjusted lighting, Another simulated a struggle with the mannequin. The scenes were mechanical, emotionless, and precise, like a dark dress rehearsal being practiced over and over. What was especially chilling was the level of detail. Props changed between tapes. The mannequin was sometimes replaced with a more realistic dummy, complete with synthetic hair and glass eyes. In one scene, blood was poured carefully onto the floor from a jug, then wiped up with meticulous care. These were not random recordings. They were deliberate, scripted. The tapes seemed to chart the progression of a plan. Each rehearsal became more refined, the performances tighter, the visuals more cinematic. At first, police assumed they were watching the delusions of a disturbed individual, perhaps someone reliving scenes from a horror movie career they could never let go of. But then came the final tape. Unlike the others, Final Take did not use mannequins or props. It featured a real girl, no older than 10, sitting at a table in what appeared to be the same room where the tapes were found. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She sat with her hands folded, staring into the camera. A masked person entered the frame and placed a plate of food in front of her. The scene was quiet and slow, almost ritualistic. Then, without warning, the screen went black. Technicians paused the video and examined it frame by frame. There were no cuts, no evidence of editing. It was real. When they ran the footage through a facial recognition database, the results stunned everyone involved. The girl was Claire Devins, a child who had gone missing in 2007. Her case had long since gone cold with no credible leads and no evidence pointing to her whereabouts. Yet here she was, unmistakably, in the basement of a house supposedly abandoned. For years. The horrifying question was no longer if something had happened to her, it was how long it had been happening. The discovery that the girl in the final tape was Claire Devins sent shockwaves through both law enforcement and the media. Claire had been a familiar name back in 2007 when her sudden disappearance on a quiet Monday morning had gripped the nation. She was last seen walking to school, a route she had taken every day without issue. Her backpack was later found discarded in a storm drain nearly 5 blocks from her home, but no other evidence surfaced. There had been no witnesses, no surveillance, footage, and no ransom demand. Her parents had appeared in several press conferences, pleading for her return, but the case eventually went cold. Over the years, her face faded from news reports, remembered only in missing child posters and the occasional anniversary feature. Now, 15 years later, her image had resurfaced, frozen in grainy footage, trapped in a room no one knew existed. Investigators pored over every second of the final tape. They studied the furniture, the lighting, even the brand of cereal on the table, looking for any details that might help establish when the footage was taken. Forensic analysts confirmed that Claire appeared older than she had in the last known photographs. Her hair was longer, her features more defined. This indicated the footage was not from the time of her disappearance, but possibly taken years later. That meant she had been alive well after the world had given up hope. And if that was true, someone had been keeping her hidden for an extended period of time. The focus of the investigation turned to Ellis Routh, the man who had owned the Hollister Lane house before disappearing himself. Routh had once worked in the film industry as a special effects artist and set designer, mostly in the horror genre. He had a reputation for being brilliant but obsessive, known for building hyper-realistic props and immersive environments. Colleagues recalled that he often blurred the line between fiction and reality, once designing a film set that was so convincing it triggered a real emergency response. After walking away from Hollywood, he retreated into obscurity. Few people knew where he went, and even fewer cared. The last trace of him was the burnt-out shell of his car, discovered in a remote forest weeks after Claire vanished. Now, with new forensic tools, investigators were able to extract fingerprints from the VHS tapes and various objects found in the secret basement. Several prints matched Ellis Routh. That alone wasn't enough for an arrest, but it confirmed that he had been in the house, possibly long after he was presumed dead. Investigators also identified partial prints belonging to a woman named Liza Hallen, a former actress who had vanished from public life in the early 2000s. She had once starred in a little-known horror film titled The Horror House Plot, where the storyline revolved around a director who staged murders inside his own home for realism. What had once seemed like a forgettable film now appeared to be a blueprint. The similarities between the movie's scenes and the VHS tapes were chilling. As the puzzle pieces came together, a terrifying theory began to form. Routh and Hallen had not disappeared. They had gone underground, building a twisted project in secret, using real people as part of their production. And Claire, somehow, had become their leading role. With Ellis, Routh and Liza Hallen now identified as central figures in the horrifying discovery, the investigation shifted into high gear. Detectives began retracing every step, every financial record, and every possible movement the two could have made since their disappearances. While both had been assumed dead, Routh because of the burned-out car, and Hallen due to her total absence from public life, there was now no question they had been operating in secrecy. The tapes proved that someone had been living in the Hollister Lane house years after it was believed abandoned. But if they had been there all this time, where had they gone after? And more urgently, was Claire still alive? A breakthrough came when investigators checked gas station surveillance footage near the Hollister property. One station, just outside, Crestwick, had captured a man buying fuel and several bags of ice just a few months before the demolition crew discovered the basement. Though the man wore a hood and kept his face turned away, investigators used gait analysis and matched his posture and physical characteristics with older footage of Ellis Routh. It wasn't definitive proof, but it narrowed the search radius. Authorities soon discovered an unregistered property deep in the woods, about 30 miles north of the town. A small plot of land purchased years earlier under the name of a dissolved film production company. It had never been listed as a residence and was hidden so well it didn't even appear on most GPS maps. When officers arrived at the property, they found what looked like a hunting cabin. The exterior was weathered, the windows blacked out with thick curtains, and there were no signs of recent human activity. But inside, the story changed. The cabin was filled with filmmaking equipment, cameras, tripods, light rigs, and props, eerily similar to those seen in the tapes. A single room had been converted into an editing studio, complete with old monitors and analog tape decks. Notes covered the walls, written in red ink, listing shot angles, lines of direction, and scene breakdowns. The names Claire and Liza appeared multiple times. One note simply read, "Final take approved. No retakes needed." The most disturbing part was hidden beneath the cabin. A trapdoor led to an underground room, a bunker with reinforced walls, a cot, a bucket toilet, and a steel door that locked from the outside. It was windowless and silent, built for complete isolation. Lining the walls were photographs, some old, some recent. All of Claire. In some she was eating. In others she was simply staring at the camera. One showed her standing in a forest, barefoot and holding a flashlight. It was dated just 6 months earlier. DNA evidence taken from hair strands and toothbrushes confirmed Claire had been there. Yet there was no trace of her now, no fresh footprints, no food, no clothing. It was as if whoever had kept her there had vanished, taking her or leaving her without a single clue. Investigators also confirmed that one of the fingerprints found in the cabin matched Liza Hallen, suggesting that she had been not just a participant, but possibly the co-director of the entire operation. What started as a simple demolition job had unraveled into something far more terrifying, a live production of horror, choreographed in complete secrecy, with real people used as actors in roles they never agreed to play. The truth was no longer about whether a crime had occurred. It was about how many, and how many more might still be unfolding in hidden locations no one yet knew existed. The discovery of the off-grid cabin and the overwhelming evidence of Claire Devon's prolonged captivity left law enforcement and the public shaken. Every piece of the puzzle pointed to something far more disturbing than a typical kidnapping or isolated criminal act. This was a long-term, carefully constructed operation designed to mimic the world of horror films, but with real victims and real consequences. Authorities launched a nationwide manhunt for Ellis, Routh and Liza Hallen, issuing federal warrants and coordinating with international agencies in case they had fled the country. Their faces reappeared in headlines, not as missing persons, but as fugitives, the masterminds of one of the most bizarre and haunting cases in recent history. But just as suddenly as the case had burst back into public awareness, it seemed to go cold again. There were no confirmed sightings of Routh or Hallen. Their bank accounts remained untouched. No digital footprints emerged. It was as if they had simply vanished into the shadows. Then, a week after the discovery of the cabin, a plain envelope arrived at the Brighton Police Department. Inside was a single VHS tape. No return address, no fingerprints. It was labeled with one word: freedom. The footage was short. It showed Claire, visibly older, walking alone through a dense forest. Her clothes were worn, and her hair hung in tangled strands, but she was walking upright, her steps steady. The camera followed her from a distance. At one point she turned to face the lens and mouthed something. There was no audio, but lip-reading experts believed she said, "I got out." The final frames showed her reaching the edge of the woods and stepping out toward what looked like a distant highway. Then the screen cut to black. No trace of Claire was ever found after that. Search teams combed through every forest in a 100-mile radius, and tips poured in from across the country. But none led to her. Her face was once again plastered on missing posters and news programs. But unlike in 2007, now everyone knew what she had endured. She was no longer the girl who disappeared on her way to school. She was the centerpiece of a living nightmare that blurred the line between fiction and reality. A victim of a script, written in secrecy, rehearsed in silence and performed in the shadows. The house on Hollister Lane was demolished quietly, without ceremony. The property was fenced off and left vacant, a silent monument to what had happened inside. Rumors continued, of course. Locals claimed to hear voices at night or see flickers of light from the lot, though no structures remained. Some said the tapes weren't the only ones, that more would surface, that this was just one of many productions hidden across the country. And strangely, they were right. Every year since the first discovery, a new tape has appeared. Different locations, different scenes, but always the same style. Carefully rehearsed, meticulously shot, and unmistakably real. No suspects, no arrests. Just footage. Each one ends the same way, with a title card that reads "Final Take." No one knows who is sending them or how many more exist. But one thing is certain: the horror was never part of a movie. It was real, and it's still not over.